Okay. Um, Hi, everyone. I'm Al Kaufman. I'm the Senior Vice President, Technical Affairs for TIA. And I'm going to talk a little bit about, we're going to step outside the borders of the U.S. and talk a little bit about some updates internationally that have an effect on toys. We're going to first talk about the European Union. There are some additional and tightened requirements which are coming into effect later this year, or in some cases have already been added to the TSD, but may or may not have been added to EN71. First of all, there are requirements on polynuclear aromatic hydrocarbons. They are limited to 0.5 ppm of each of these listed PAHs. And that became effective December 27, 2015. So I just wanted to remind people of that one. So that one's already in effect. Formamide limits. If you make EVA playmats, the requirement is going to be in force as of May 24th, 2017. But be aware that several European countries already have interim bans in place which mirror these requirements. First of all, there's a limit of 200 parts per million of content of formamide. However, if you are higher than 200 parts per million, there is a second step that you can go to, which is an emissions test. However, it's a 28-day emissions test. It is complicated and expensive, and I would recommend that you try to keep your formamide limit below that 200 part per million trigger level so that you don't have to go on to that second piece of the test. So, and you'll find these typically in foam products, primarily EVA, and the formamide is really coming from two places. Formamide is used as a solvent during polymerization of EVA, but the largest contribution is as a side product of azo blowing agents like azodicarbonamide, which is very commonly used to foam plastics such as EVA. So. Then there are content limits on 3 preservatives. One of them, BIT, is becoming effective in May 2017. And then 2 others, MI and CMI. Typically, you don't see these independently. They're usually in a 3-to-1 mixture, which is sold by Roman Haas under the trade name Kaufman. These are being restricted because they're suspected of being sensitizers and skin irritants. But they're very, very effective preservatives. So those restrictions come into play in November of 2017. There is a proposed reduction in the BPA limit. You're probably aware of the fact that there's already a migration limit on BPA in toys of 0.1 ppm, and it's being lowered to 0.04 ppm. However, the date is not certain at this point. We're looking at probably Q2 of 2018 as an effective date. So. There are proposed lead migration limits. Again, we don't have a final date for this, but this is the direction that clearly the European Union is going in. These are migration limits. Again, they're not content limits, but the proposal is for powder-like or pliable materials, reducing the limit from 13.5 ppm to 2 ppm. For category 2, the liquid or sticky materials from 3.4 to 0.5 ppm. And for category 3, let's see, it looks like it got cut off there, but scraped off materials, reducing it from 160 to 23 ppm. And this is based on the fact that the European Union does periodic reviews and makes decisions on whether existing limits need to be tightened based on new scientific information. But because of the application of the precautionary principle, sometimes let's say sometimes the decisions are more political than they are scientific. So and this is probably a case in point. Moving on to Indonesia, we've actually been engaged in Indonesia for more than 2 years now. We're making progress, but it's moving very slowly, as a lot of things do there. They have what's called it's a Ministry of Industry Regulation, it's an SNI, which requires testing at what they term an LS Pro, which is an approved laboratory or one of the affiliates of that LS Pro. Currently, they are all Indonesian. There was a 2-year grace period when other labs were allowed to test. That 2-year period ended in April of 2016. It requires testing of every import shipment, while domestic shipments only have to be tested every 6 months. It requires affixing that SNI mark to the product, and the plans are for some enforcement at the retail level. The standard is actually not that difficult to meet. The problem is really the conformity assessment process. The standard is very similar to ISO 8124. They've added phthalates, which align pretty much with the US and the European Union. There's a formaldehyde limit, which is fairly tight. It's 20 parts per million. However, it's very close to the detection limit for the method, the ISO method they've specified, so we continue to work with them on that. And then the ASO dye requirements, they've basically lifted from the European Union. So again, if you're selling elsewhere, you're probably not going to have much trouble complying with the product requirements. However, there are a lot of hoops that you end up having to jump through in order to get your product into the country. We've had people report a 5 or a 6-fold increase in the amount of time it takes them to get product into the country. So it's created a real issue. So we continue to engage with MOI there. We actually had a successful workshop with them in Jakarta in the fall of 2016. I was there along with a number of others, the Southeast Asian Toy Association. The regulation, finally, we have convinced them that they need to revise it, so it's reportedly under revision. However, there is a more problematic development potentially, which is they are developing a toy industry roadmap. They've already developed these roadmaps for other industries, and based on what we've seen from other industries, we're a little concerned because there is a tendency to have local content requirements. In other words, that toys might be subject to a minimum Indonesian content requirement as they move forward. So again, we're engaged there. We've also engaged U.S. trade representative in the Department of Commerce. So we've engaged the U.S. government in what we see as a technical trade barrier, and we continue to work with the Indonesians through a coalition, including some local Indonesian businesses. Brazil, they've been very active lately. InMetro is the regulator there. There are a couple. We've actually had 4 ordinances in the last 6 months, but Ordinance 512 establishes what's called product registration requirements. They're moving from an individual product registration, which was the case before that everyone had kind of accommodated to, and now they're going to what's called family registration, where groups of products can be registered as a family. However, we've tried to point out to them that the toy industry is somewhat unique, both in terms of the number of SKUs, which might constitute a family, and the fact that it's a very fashion-driven business. There's a lot of turnover. Some members say that 80% of their product line turns over every year, and so trying to keep that family registration up to date creates a huge administrative burden. Ordinance 563 establishes the actual test requirements for the product. And while the individual requirements themselves are not that difficult, what we do have trouble with is that there's no single location. In other words, most countries have a product standard that you can go to and review and say, okay, I know what the requirements are. What InMetro has done is sort of done it piecemeal through these ordinances, so you have to look in multiple locations to find all of the requirements, which certainly doesn't help the likelihood of conformity. Products also have to be registered and certified and marked prior to importation into the country, which creates an issue because you have to bring the product in, get it tested, certified, registered, and then mark the product outside the country before you can import it, which creates a huge issue for importers. We're working with them to try to allow some sort of conditional entry or maybe entry into a bonded warehouse where that process could be undertaken. So hopefully we'll be able to cut the amount of time it takes to import product. The other issue that we see is Brazil nominally uses the NM 300 standard, which is actually the Mercosur standard, which is the trade bloc for the Southern Cone, Paraguay, Argentina, Brazil. And there are multiple deviations from that standard. That NM 300 standard was actually based on ISO 8124. The problem is that ISO has been revised several times. NM 300 has not kept pace with it, so it's deviated from that perspective. And then we have Inmetro layering these additional Brazilian requirements on top of it, which is creating a potential, a lot of confusion, let's put it that way. Again, the administrative burden, CBI concerns, Inmetro has asked for a lot of information that really isn't necessary in our view for product registration, and there's really not a lot of protection for confidential business information. So we continue to engage with them. I was there actually 2 weeks ago, met with Inmetro and also with the Ministry of Industry. What we are seeing is that with the change of administrations there, Brazil seems to be moving away from their previous sort of mercantilist, protectionist approach to this, to imported products, and starting to embrace more the idea of free trade, although I think turning the ocean liner is going to take us a while. Again, this is a country where things don't move very quickly. We also are hopeful that at some point we can talk to them about the 35% tariff on imported toys, which currently exists, which is higher even than the Mercosur marginal rate of 25%. So, Gulf Cooperation Country or Council countries. They've issued standards and registration and marking requirements. However, it's an extremely confusing landscape because we continue to get conflicting information from GSO, which is the Gulf Standards Organization, and from the individual countries which are responsible for enforcement. But the product standard requirements essentially mirror the European Union Toy Safety Directive and EN 71 series of requirements. They have a G mark, which must be affixed to the product with a registration number. You have to have it tested by an accredited lab. So far, so good. However, there's difficulty in getting clear information as to whether you have to put it on the product or the package, whether a sticker is acceptable. They also have a new type acceptance process, which involves putting a QR code on the product. We were originally told that this was voluntary for toys because there's a harmonized standard that covers them. However, we're also hearing conflicting information that all toys have to go through this type acceptance process and have the QR code accepted. So, again, we continue to engage. We've had numerous conversations with USTR and with Commerce. They're assisting us in trying to get some clarity around these requirements and trying to bring some sense to them. Non-aligned enforcement is also an issue. It appears that because individual countries within the GCC have customs authorities that are responsible for enforcing these requirements on incoming product that's imported, each of them sort of takes a slightly different approach to how they perform enforcement. Again, we're engaged. We will continue to be engaged, and we think that we'll be able to make some progress there based on our conversations so far. And that is it. And at this point, I'll take questions.
Thanks a lot, Al. Great presentation.
Thanks.
I had a question on the PAH for Europe. We've been testing for PAH for a while now, and many times we see the lab reports come through and they've miscategorized the toy. Instead, category 1 is the most strict, and category 2, category 3. Are there any objective guidelines that TIA has worked with members on to categorize exposure levels for different types of typically plastics that may or may not have a PAH chemical?
We haven't published anything specific, John, but we, as you know, the requirements apply. They're primarily concerned about mouthable products or products which are in prolonged contact with the skin, because these potentially could be absorbed through the skin. The other issue, I think, is making sure that you are really looking in the places where you might find them. I mean, typically you're going to find them either in extender oils for rubbers or in vulcanized rubber itself because you get side reactions from the accelerators. Carbon black is also a potential source if you're using it as a pigment. But beyond that, this testing is not something that you should be doing routinely. You should be able to exclude a significant amount of your product unless it falls into that fairly narrow category. So, does that answer your question? Okay. Yes.
Thank you very much. When you meet with these countries like Brazil, for example, or GSO organization or other, right, Indonesia, do you cooperate with, do you get the other industry standard organization involved? Because if you are meeting with them, get EN, involved, EU authorities involved, or maybe working with the ISO. For example, Brazil, I mean, they have not done any updating on the ISO standards. So do you get ISO standards or, involved when we are meeting with these countries, or it is all TIA?
Well, it isn't all TIA in a couple of different ways. It's a good question, Ali. Thank you. First of all, we maintain very close relationships with other toy associations around the world. For instance, in Indonesia, at the WTO TBT committee meetings, we've had the EU weigh in with the same comments that we have had or very similar comments. We've reached out to the Japan Toy Association. They've had their ministry register those same comments at the WTO TBT meetings. So yes, we do a lot of networking. We want to make sure that it's not just us saying that there's an issue. The other way that we work is if it makes sense, and we have to kind of tailor this to each situation, we might form a coalition. For instance, in Indonesia, it became very obvious that the Ministry of Industry was more likely to listen to local businesses than they would to someone who was importing product. And so we actually enlisted some of the local businesses who are also importers, brought them into a coalition. The Southeast Asian Toy Association is engaged as well. And so, in fact, a lot of our efforts there are through this local group so that it has more of a local face on the advocacy effort than really somebody flying in from the U.S. and saying, you're doing this all wrong. I mean, that's not likely to be accepted very well. So having local businesses weigh in with some of the same concerns, I think, has been much more effective. And in fact, I think that's when we started to see things turn there. So does that answer your question? Other questions? Okay, thank you very much.
I think Ed's gonna come back and